Frost covered the fence posts like white lace that October morning, each one standing stiff and silent against a sky the color of old iron. The water trough had frozen solid overnight. The wind came down from the mountains carrying the kind of cold that finds every crack in a man's coat and settles into his bones like it means to stay. Now, I want to tell you about a man named Samuel Foster, not a rich man, not a famous one, just a ranch hand living in a cabin at the edge of Copper Springs, Colorado, close enough to hear the church bells on Sunday, far enough that nobody bothered to ring them for him. Samuel worked leather by lamplight that morning, his hands cracked and dry as the land itself, 31 years old, and those hands looked 50. They'd mended fences, shoot horses, hauled hay since he was 14, but come evening, those same rough hands turned gentle as a prayer. His daughter Emma was 7. Born with her left leg twisted inward at the ankle, she walked with a hitch that made folks stare and then look away, which was somehow worse than the staring. Her mama had died, bringing her into the world, and Samuel had raised her alone ever since. He knelt beside her bed now, working salve into the tight muscles of her calf. The single lamp threw their shadows long against the cabin wall, one large, one small, both leaning toward each other. His calloused fingers moved slow and careful over the twisted ankle, the same way every night. The one tenderness he allowed himself. Emma watched him with eyes too old for her face. "Pa," she whispered, "will I always walk funny?" His hands stopped, just for a heartbeat. Then they kept working, steady and sure, because that's what hands do when a heart can't find words. "You walk just fine, ladybug. Billy Pruitt says I walk like a broke-leg colt. Billy Pruitt don't know nothing about nothing." Samuel pulled the wool blanket to her chin. "You walk like Emma Foster. That's the best way of walking there is." She smiled at that, small and quick, like a bird landing on a fence post before flying off again. Samuel blew out the lamp and stood in the darkness, listening to her breathing slow towards sleep. Outside, frost kept building on those fence posts. The cabin's single window glowed faint against the October night, one small light in all that darkness. Holding on. "It's enough," Samuel whispered to himself. "She's enough." But his voice cracked on the second word, and the cold crept in through every gap. November brought the widow from the dry goods store, Sarah Hendricks, 40 years old. Pleasant enough. She came for Sunday supper carrying a pie and wearing her good dress. Samuel had scrubbed the cabin floor twice and trimmed his beard for the first time in months. Everything went fine until Emma came in from the porch. The girl took 3 steps that familiar uneven gait, left foot dragging slightly, and Sarah's smile changed, not disappeared, changed, became the kind of smile people wear at funerals. "Well," Sarah said, setting down her fork, "I just remembered I promised to help Mrs. Crawford with her preserves." She was gone before the pie was cut. December came harder. The schoolteacher, Miss Ann Kelly, passing through on her way to Denver, pretty, young, sharp. She and Samuel talked 2 hours on the general store porch while Emma sat reading nearby. When Emma stood to leave, her twisted leg catching on the step, Miss Kelly's face went flat as a closed door. "Mr. Foster, I'll be plain with you," she said the next day. "I didn't come west to raise a defective child." Emma had been around the corner of the building. Samuel saw it in her eyes that night, something dimming behind them, like a lamp turned low. The third one hurt worst. Clara Bennett. a seamstress from Pueblo. She brought Emma a blue hair ribbon the second time she visited, and on the third visit she braided the girl's hair with it, humming a song about meadowlarks while Emma sat perfectly still with her eyes closed, leaning into the touch the way a child does when she's forgotten to be careful. Samuel watched from the kitchen doorway, his chest so tight he couldn't swallow. For 2 whole weeks, he let himself hope. Then he overheard Clara outside the mercantile, telling her friend he's a decent man, but that child needs an institution. The state home in Denver takes crippled children. It'd be a kindness, really. He ended it that evening. No explanation, no argument. Just, I don't reckon this is gonna work out, ma'am. Christmas morning, he found Emma by the stove. She'd untied the blue ribbon from her hair and was holding it over the open grate. Her fingers weren't shaking. Her face showed nothing at all. You don't gotta do that, ladybug. It's just a ribbon. Pa, she let it fall. The silk curled orange, then black, then nothing. It's just you and me now, Samuel said, his voice rough. That's enough. Emma nodded, but her eyes lowered. Her eyes said what her mouth wouldn't. She knew, she'd always known. She was the reason nobody stayed. January's cold came down like a judgment. Samuel found the advertisement by accident, an old newspaper lining Emma's boot for insulation, the way poor folks did when leather wore thin. He pulled it out, and there it was, between a notice for patent medicine and a cattle auction, matrimonial correspondence, respectable ladies seeking Western husbands. He sat at the table after Emma fell asleep, dipped his pen, wrote by the single lamp's light. Dear Sirs, my name is Samuel Foster. I am a ranch hand of honest character, 31 years of age. I have a daughter. The pen hovered. Somewhere in the next line, he'd have to describe Emma's leg. He'd have to put into words the thing that made every woman turn away and mail that truth to a stranger and wait for the rejection to arrive by post instead of in person. Samuel stared at the letter for a long time. The ink dried on the nib. Then he tore the page in half, tore it again, carried the pieces to the porch, and let the January wind take them scraps of paper spinning into darkness like small surrendered prayers. That was the night Samuel Foster stopped hoping. He'd tried 3 doors, and each had locked behind the same silence. A man learns eventually. He sets his jaw and gets on with the work of living. Now 300 miles east, a woman named Margaret Wilson sat in a passenger car on the 215 from St. Louis. She was 27, with careful posture and hands that kept adjusting the high collar of her dress. Her fingers moved to the fabric the way Samuel's moved to Emma's leg out of long habit, tending a wound that never fully healed. Beneath that collar, burn scars spread from her jaw down her neck and across her left shoulder, a kerosene accident when she was 6 years old, 21 years of hiding. She was heading to Copper Springs to marry a rancher named Thomas Avery, a man she'd never met, a man who'd never seen her scars. The train rocked westward through the night. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching snow-covered plains slide past like a white page nobody had written on yet. Somewhere ahead, a man and his daughter sat in a cabin lit by a single lamp, not knowing she was coming, but she was. The Copper Springs platform was nothing but weathered planks and a wooden awning when Margaret stepped off the train in mid-January. Wind hit her like a wall. She pulled her coat tighter and adjusted her collar, always the collar. First thing, every time scanning the platform for Thomas Avery, he wasn't there yet. What Margaret noticed instead was a man and a small girl sitting on the far bench. The man had rough hands folded in his lap, a worn hat pulled low, the quiet stillness of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. The girl pressed against his side like she was trying to melt into his coat and disappear. Then the girl shifted, and Margaret saw the left leg twisted inward at the ankle, extended carefully to avoid bumping the bench. The child wore a brace made of leather and wood, the kind a man might fashion himself when he couldn't afford a doctor's model. Margaret's hand rose to her own neck. She caught herself, stopped, pressed her fingers flat against her thigh. But the phantom heat was already there, the old burn prickling beneath her collar, the way it always did when she recognized her own wound walking around in someone else's body. She knew that posture, not the leg, but the hiding, the way the girl tucked herself small and still, the way her eyes tracked every passing stranger, not hoping, just measuring the distance between herself and the next flinch. Margaret had spent her whole life reading that moment on people's faces, the half second when their eyes found the edge of her scars above the collar, the rearrangement of expression into something polite and distant. She'd catalogued 100 versions of that look, and she recognized the girl's vigilance because she had invented her own version of it at the same age. Samuel glanced up. Their eyes met across the platform. He looked away first, the automatic withdrawal of a man accustomed to shielding his daughter from the gaze of strangers. Margaret sat on a bench opposite. She set her travel case beside her and folded her hands in her lap. She told herself she was simply resting after a long journey. Her fingers found the scar tissue along her left knuckle and pressed it, the way she did when something stirred in her that she wasn't ready to name. The girl gripped her father's sleeve, her twisted leg angled away from view, as though she could make it invisible with the right geometry. Margaret couldn't stop watching her, couldn't stop remembering being 6 years old, learning for the first time that the world would always look at the scar before it looked at her. Margaret didn't plan to cross the platform. Her body just did it, stood, walked, stopped 3 feet from the bench. Samuel tensed. His hand moved to Emma's shoulder, the reflex of a man bracing for what always came next. "Afternoon," he said, guarded. "Good afternoon." Margaret smiled, but her eyes were on the girl, who had pressed herself behind her father's arm like a rabbit going to ground. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Silence. Then a whisper from behind Samuel's sleeve. "Emma? That's a beautiful name. I'm Margaret." The girl peered out. Her eyes went to Margaret's collar, then her face. Emma opened her mouth, closed it. Her jaw tightened the muscles of a child, gathering courage the way an adult gathers breath before a plunge, and then she forced the words out like stones she'd been carrying too long. "I'm lame. Nobody wants me. Now, I want you to hold on to this moment, because what happened next changed everything." Margaret's eyes filled. She didn't wipe the tears. She didn't look away. She knelt right there on those cold wooden planks, bringing herself level with Emma's face. And she reached up and pulled her collar aside. The scars spread from below her jaw down her neck and across her left shoulder, pale, ridged skin, tight and shining where the kerosene had burned deepest. Emma's eyes went wide, her mouth fell open, and her grip on Samuel's sleeve loosened. "I was burned badly as a child. Margaret said. Her voice was steady even as the tears fell. See my scars. People said nobody would want me either. They said I was damaged goods. She leaned closer. But we're both wrong, Emma. We're not defective. We're perfect for those who truly see us. Emma stared at the scars. Then she looked at her own twisted leg, then back at Margaret's neck. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Samuel stood frozen. His hands hung at his sides, open and useless. 6 years of courtship, 3 women who had come and gone. Not one of them had knelt. Is her mother? Margaret asked, looking up at him. Samuel's throat worked. Died in childbirth. Margaret nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer empty comfort. She just held the truth between them, undecorated, the way you hold something fragile. A buggy appeared at the end of the main street, Thomas Avery's rig. Right on time, Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt, adjusting her collar back into place. She touched Emma's shoulder once, lightly, the way you touch something you already know you can't walk away from. It was a pleasure meeting you, Emma Foster. She walked toward the buggy. Emma watched her go. For the first time in months, the girl didn't look down at her own leg. She looked at the woman's neck, where the scars were hidden again beneath high fabric, where nobody could see what Margaret carried unless she chose to show them. Thomas Avery's ranch house had real china and curtains with lace edges. The dining table seated 8. A hired girl served roast beef on platters so polished Margaret could see her own distorted face in the silver. Thomas sat at the head of the table, 45, well built, respectable. He asked about her journey, about St. Louis, about her family's standing. His questions were organized the way a man organizes an inventory, checking boxes, assessing value. He did not ask about her scars. His eyes touched the collar of her dress once, briefly, the way you'd note a crack in a china cup before setting it back on the shelf. A man's worth is in what he builds, Thomas said, gesturing at the dining room with his fork. This house, the land, the cattle, took me 15 years. I aim to pass it to sons. Margaret nodded and cut her beef. Do you know many folks in town? She asked. Most everyone. Copper Springs ain't large. Thomas reached for the salt, and his hand passed over her water glass without pausing, without adjusting, as if she and her place setting were simply furniture arranged for his convenience. You'll meet them at church come Sunday. I noticed a man and a young girl at the station. His daughter had a Samuel Foster. Thomas didn't look up. Good worker, keeps to himself mostly. Sad situation with that girl of his, lame since birth. Tried courting a few women, but can't nobody blame them for not wanting to take that on. The word lame landed like a stone in still water. Margaret's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, the way a person does when the alternative is saying something they can't take back. I imagine it's been hard for both of them, she said. I reckon, but that's the way of it. Thomas poured himself more wine without offering her any. Some hands you just gotta play as they're dealt. That night, Margaret lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling. The bed was soft, the room was warm, the lace curtains moved in the draft. She touched her scars in the darkness. She thought about Emma's face the moment the girl had looked at Margaret's burn-tightened skin and seen not damage but a mirror. She thought about the drawings a child like that might make. Family portraits with a space where a mother should be. a blank spot filled in with crayon and wishing. Thomas Avery would never ask about the scars. He would accommodate them the way the town accommodated Emma's leg, with averted eyes and practical silence. Margaret would be comfortable here, fed, sheltered, unseen. She reached for the packet of engagement letters on the nightstand. Instead of placing it in the drawer, she shoved it to the bottom of her travel case and pressed the latches shut. Margaret told Thomas she was taking a walk. She did not say where. The cabin sat at the edge of town exactly as she remembered, small, neat, the kind of place a man builds when he's given up expecting company. Thin smoke rose from the chimney. The fence posts wore their January frost like armor. Samuel opened the door with the expression of a man who hadn't had a visitor since autumn. "Ma'am, I believe I dropped my handkerchief at the station." Margaret held up the one she'd taken from her own pocket that morning. "I was wondering if you might have found it." He hadn't. They both knew it, but he stepped aside and let her in. The cabin was clean, spare, and warm. Emma sat at the table drawing with stubby crayons. When she saw Margaret, she didn't hide. She didn't smile either. She just watched with those old soul eyes, measuring, waiting to see what this woman would do now that the platform was behind them and real life was in front. "What are you drawing, Emma?" The girl covered the page with her hand. Then, slowly, she lifted it. "Families, 4 drawings, each one different, a man, a child, and in every picture a woman standing beside them, yellow crayon hair in one, brown in another, sometimes red, always smiling, always reaching for the child's hand, always there." Margaret's breath caught. She looked at Samuel. He stood by the stove, shame flooding his face, his daughter's deepest longing laid bare on the kitchen table for a near stranger to see. "She's real talented," Margaret said quietly. "She draws a lot." His jaw was tight. He didn't look at the pictures. They talked. Not about anything important at first, the cold snap, the ranch work, how Emma liked her school teacher, but underneath the small words, something true was building. 2 people who'd stopped performing. 2 people whose hands were cracked and dry from the same kind of labor, his from leather and fence wire, hers from lye soap and sewing needles. Margaret asked the question she already knew the answer to. Is it just the 2 of you? Since the day she was born? That must be lonesome. "I got Emma, that's enough." The same words from October. They sounded different now, less like conviction, more like a fence a man builds not because he wants walls, but because he can't survive another thing breaking through. Emma tugged Margaret's sleeve. "Are you gonna be Mr. Avery's wife?" Margaret looked at the girl, at the twisted leg beneath the table, at the drawings of mothers. "I don't know yet, sweetheart." Emma reached out and took Margaret's hand, the scarred one. Her small fingers found the ridge of burn-tightened skin along the knuckle and rested there, not tracing, not flinching, just holding. The way you hold something you've decided belongs to you. Margaret didn't pull away. Samuel didn't speak. The lamp flame steadied in its glass, and Emma kept holding on. Margaret walked home in the fading light. Halfway between the cabin and the Avery ranch, she stopped in the middle of the frozen road. The cold bit at her face. She reached up and pulled her collar down, exposing the scars to the January air. The wind touched the ridged skin sharp, honest, real. She kept walking toward the cabin's light. She did not look back at the Avery ranch. She told Thomas over breakfast, eggs and coffee and the end of a sensible future. I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Avery, but I can't marry you. Thomas set his cup down slowly. Beg your pardon. I'm sorry, truly. You've been generous, but it wouldn't be fair to either of us. His jaw tightened. Confusion gave way to something sharper. You came all the way from St. Louis. You ain't serious. I am. For who? His eyes narrowed, then widened. Foster, the ranch hand. He laughed short, disbelieving. You'll have nothing, Margaret. He can barely keep that cabin warm come February. You're throwing away a good life for a man who sees me, Mr. Avery. I see you just fine. No, sir. You see my collar. She stood and folded her napkin beside her plate. I'm going where I'm known for what I am. I hope you find a woman who suits you. I mean that kindly. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a ledger that won't balance, baffled, irritated, already moving on to the next column. Margaret packed her travel case in 10 minutes, walked the half mile to Samuel's cabin in February cold, her boots crunching frozen mud, her heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her teeth. She had no plan beyond the next 30 seconds, no script, just the truth and the memory of a child's hand on her scars. Samuel was on the porch mending a harness. He stood when he saw her coming, the leather strap hanging forgotten from his fingers. His hands, those dry, cracked, working hands, fell to his sides, uncertain. Ma'am, is something wrong? Margaret stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She was trembling, and not from the weather. I told Mr. Avery I can't marry him. Samuel's face went blank. Why would you do that? Because he looks at my scars the way those women looked at Emma's leg. She gripped the porch rail. Would you consider a woman with scars, Mr. Foster? For you and Emma, the words hung in the frozen air. Samuel's lips parted. His eyes searched her face, then moved past her to the cabin door, where a small sound had come from inside. Margaret turned. Emma stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her twisted leg braced against the threshold. Margaret's gaze was already there, already on the girl, already kneeling before Samuel could answer, lowering herself to Emma's level the same way she had on the train platform, the same way she always would. Would you have me, Emma? Samuel watched Margaret's eyes. They weren't on him. They were fixed on his daughter with a tenderness so fierce it burned brighter than any lamp he'd ever lit, and he understood then fully, like a dawn breaking over a valley, that this woman had not come for him. She had come for Emma first. He was the gift she was willing to accept along the way. I reckon, he said, his voice barely working, I'd be honored. Emma stepped forward. She didn't hide. She crossed the threshold on her uneven legs and wrapped her arms around Margaret's neck, pressing her small face against the scars she'd held in her hands 2 days before. 3 pairs of hands, rough, scarred, small, finding each other on a cold porch. The lamp behind them threw their shadows together on the cabin wall. For the first time, there were three. Valentine's Day came mild that year. February's sun softened the ground and set the icicles dripping from the eaves. The frost on the fence posts, those same fence posts that had stood stiff and white back in October, each one separate and frozen in the dark, was melting now, dark wood showing through, wet and alive in the light. Samuel stood at the cabin's small mirror, trying to flatten his hair with water. His hands were still rough, still cracked. But last night Margaret had sat beside him on the porch step and rubbed salve into his knuckles slow, careful, thorough the way he'd rubbed salve into Emma's leg every night for 7 years. He'd stared at her hands, working over his, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Samuel Foster felt tended to. The wedding was small. Preacher Collins came out from town. A few ranch hands Samuel had worked with stood along the fence, hats in hand. Mrs. Crawford from the general store brought a cake she said she'd been meaning to bake anyway, which fooled nobody and pleased everyone. Emma carried a fistful of winter wildflowers, the first brave stems pushing through the last of the snow along the creek bank. She walked down the short path from the cabin to the fence gate where the preacher waited, her gait uneven and unhurried, her chin level with the mountains. She did not hide her leg. She did not look down. She walked like Emma Foster. And that morning, it was the finest way of walking there was. Margaret wore her collar open. The scars on her neck caught the February sunlight, and she led them, for the first time in 21 years. She stood before others without covering what the fire had done to her skin. Samuel looked at her and saw not the damage, not what was missing or marred, but the woman who had knelt on a cold platform and given his daughter the words he'd never found. The vows were simple, no poetry, no grand declarations, just two people standing in late winter light, saying honest things. I take you as you are, Margaret said. And I take you, Samuel replied, scars and all, every last one. Folks watched from a respectful distance. Some had talked, of course they had. A mail order bride refusing her intended match for a poor ranch hand, and his disabled daughter, Copper Springs, would chew on that one for years. But watching them now, his rough hands holding her scarred ones, the girl between them with wild flowers crushed against her Sunday dress, even the gossips went quiet. There are some things that make argument feel small. After the preacher said his piece, Emma took Margaret's hand. Margaret took Samuel's. They walked together toward the cabin, Emma's gait hitching and steady, Margaret's collar open to the wind, Samuel's dry hands holding them both. Inside, the single lamp was already burning, though it was still afternoon. Come evening, three shadows would move behind that window glass instead of two, and the light, that stubborn, solitary light that had held on through October frost and November rejection and the long, frozen dark of a January without hope, burned on. But Lord, it burned brighter now.